I think we good. Welcome back to Wednesday Night Bible Study. We're doing fine tonight. The weather this weekend, don't know if we're going to be doing fine or not. We'll have to see. So make sure and pay attention to the inclement weather policies that we have for during the week. Just as a reminder, during the week we follow Fairfax County schools. So if the school is not meeting, the church office is closed. On the weekends, we are promised to let you know by 7 a.m. on Sunday, and we'll send that all out on our social media networks and realm. If we can make a decision earlier than that, we'll let you know earlier than that, but just be aware of that incoming. Anything we need to talk about before we get going?
A little thing.
Yes?
We watched last Wednesday at home.
Yeah?
And when there's conversation or questions.
You can't hear at home. Yeah. Usually, not usually. I try to remember to repeat what people have said, and I don't. And so that's true. You could wave at me and say things. That would be great. Yes, I forget to repeat things. Sometimes someone will remind me to repeat things, and then I do, but I often don't. I will try to remember that means repeat something. Yes, okay. Fair enough. You'll be here. You don't need me to repeat it. That's right. Anyway, when last we left our heroes, they had just finished the Passover meal that they took together, and they went out to the Mount of Olives. So that's where we join the story now in Luke 22. Jesus left, made his way to the Mount of Olives, as was his custom, and the disciples followed him. When he arrived, he said to them, "Pray that you won't give in to temptation." He withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed. He said, "Father, if it's your will, take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not my will, but your will must be done." Then a heavenly angel appeared to him and strengthened him. He was in anguish and prayed even more earnestly. His sweat became like drops of blood falling on the ground. When he got up from praying, he went to the disciples. He found them asleep, overcome by grief. He said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you won't give in to temptation." So we have the garden scene. It's always interesting to see how people depict things. It seems so often the garden scenes with Jesus always have him sort of serenely looking into heaven with the light of heaven beaming down on his face. This is not the picture Luke gives us at all. This is a person in anguish. This is sweating drops of blood. I let this cup pass. Let this be another way. Let there be another way. Not what I want though, but what your will must be done. There is the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. It's in Trappist, Kentucky. It's a Trappist monastery, just south of Louisville. And it was the Abbey of Thomas Merton, if you know the name Thomas Merton. This abbey has statues in the middle of the woods there in the rolling hills of western Kentucky. And you have to sort of walk, it's about a mile off of the road back into the woods. And then you get to this clearing. And the first thing you see are 3 sleeping disciples, life-size sleeping disciples that you get there. When you go a little bit further, there's this picture of Jesus praying, just in truly capturing the agony. It's not a picture, it's a statue of Jesus praying, a life-size statue of him praying. I have a rendering of it, a picture I took of it in my office. It's probably one of the most beautiful and powerful, for me, pictures of this event that I ever saw, because it truly does capture this sense of anguish of what is coming. But this willingness of Christ to be obedient even when there is this temptation to not be, to let it pass, overcoming that temptation. So, but they don't get a chance we don't get that repeat failure that you get in the other Gospels. He just tells them the one time, and then while he was still speaking, a crowd appeared. And the one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him. Jesus said to him, "Judas, would you betray the human one, the Son of Man, with a kiss?" When those around him recognized what was about to happen, they said, "Lord, should we fight with our swords?" One of them struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. Jesus responded, "Stop, no more of this." He touched the slave's ear and healed him. So, obviously, this is not how do you get to someone's right ear on this? Well, if you're right-handed, you're swinging toward this right ear, and it is probably the ear lobe that is the word that is often used. So he's trying this, whoever is swinging the sword here, who's unnamed in this gospel, is going for the head. This is not a, he didn't, this is a, this is coming at the person's neck to do it. This is a violent act. So we're about to see, remember last week when they said, are 2 swords enough? And Jesus like, you know what, I think we're done talking. And he goes out. We see he's not wanting them to use the swords here. So the swords, Jesus was clearly using the word sword differently than the disciples were hearing the word sword. And we see that in action here as Jesus is not going to spring attack. This is the best time though. I mean, I get the disciples' point. These are temple guards. These aren't Romans. It's just it's a smaller group. You've got your disciples with you. This is a good time to start. I mean, it's not as good as standing in the middle of the temple when you could get the crowd on your side, but still not a bad time to try. If you're going to start a military rebellion here, this could work, but clearly not what Jesus wanted to happen. Even healing the person who was injured by one of his servants, by one of his disciples. So. Yes, she asked if it's the same night they shared the Passover meal. It is, yes. They eat, and then they go out here to pray, and in the middle of the night, that's when this is happening. Yeah. Is the next day. Yeah, it's the next. Oh, yes. It's a very fast action. I mean, the last 24 hours, lots is happening. Yeah. And interestingly, about 1/3 of the Gospel of John is dedicated to the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. It's remarkable how much John is. Right. That's probably because John, it feels longer than one night because John does say so much. But Luke spreads it out a little more, but yeah. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard, the elders who'd come to get him, have you come with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a thief? Day after day I was with you in the temple. You didn't arrest me. But this is your time when darkness rules. After they arrested Jesus, they led him away and brought him to the high priest's house. So he mocks, you could have had me any day, but of course they were afraid of the crowd there, right? The crowds were on Jesus' side, so got to do this at night. When they lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down, Peter sat among them. Then a servant woman saw him sitting in the firelight. She stared at him and said, this man was with him too. Peter denied it, saying, women, I don't know him. A little while later, someone else saw him and said, you're the one of them too. But Peter said, man, I'm not. An hour or so later, someone else insisted, this man must have been with him because he's a Galilean too. Peter responded, man, I don't know what you're talking about. At that very moment, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter, and Peter remembered the Lord's words, before a rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter went out and cried uncontrollably. So Jesus is seeing Peter is something that Luke gives us. We don't have that in the other synoptics, but this moment of dramatic eye contact that happens in Luke is a feature of Luke here, seeing Peter on the outside. So this, you might remember in Matthew, this is happening during the trial at night. So he's in the high priest's house and they're having the conversation about Jesus, and then it cuts to this scene, and then it cuts back to the trial. But in Luke, you don't have a nighttime trial in the high priest's house. They don't tell a story about any trial at night. The trial comes at the next day. The men who were holding Jesus in custody taunted him while they beat him. They blindfolded him, asked him repeatedly, prophesy who hit you. Insulting him, they said many other horrible things against him. As morning came, the elders of the people, both chief priests and legal experts, came together, and Jesus was brought before their council. They said, if you are the Christ, tell us. He answered, if I tell you, you won't believe, and if I ask you a question, you won't answer. But from now on, the human one will be seated on the right side of the power of God. They all said, are you God's son then? He replied, you say that I am. Then they said, why do we need further testimony? We've heard it from his own lips. So he's not cooperating. He's being evasive in his answers. But basically his point is, doesn't matter. You're not going to believe me anyway. So it doesn't really matter what I have to say here. It is interesting that they don't have the whole issue of blasphemy, and they don't get a verdict like you do in the synoptics. Here they just have this, why are we even talking about anything else? The whole assembly got up and led Jesus to Pilate and began to accuse him. They said, we found this man misleading our people, opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar and claiming that he is the Christ, a king. So we know that none of these things are true, right? We just had the question about taxes, and he didn't say don't pay taxes. I mean, he evaded that very skillfully. Rome is not going to care one bit about misleading our people. That doesn't mean anything. Apart from, unless that misleading means don't pay taxes to Caesar and that Jesus is king. So they're coming at this from a political perspective, right? He's misleading the people out there. He's saying that you don't pay taxes to Caesar and that he's king. So they're trying to frame this as direct threat to the state, because that's the only thing the Romans are going to care about. They're going to care about blasphemy. They're going to care about heresy. They're going to care about, Jesus is Lord as opposed to Caesar is Lord, because Caesar is Lord. And if they're saying Jesus is Lord, no, that's a problem. So Pilate asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "That's what you say," which was his last answer to them too. Not cooperating with Pilate either. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and crowds, "I find no legal basis for action against this man." This is an important feature of the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' innocence. That is something that is repeated. We're going to see it repeated by Pilate. We're going to see it repeated by the thief on the cross. We're going to see it repeated by Joseph of Arimathea. We're going to see it repeated by the centurion at the crucifixion. Jesus' innocence is an important emphasis in the Gospel of Luke. He's a martyr, and we'll talk more about this in a second. But Luke sets him up as the innocent martyr, the victim of this. They objected strenuously, saying, "He agitates the people with his teaching throughout Judea, starting from Galilee all the way here." Hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. "Aha! Here's my way out of this. I don't have to deal with this situation. I can push this off to another district. This is perfect." So, when he learned that Jesus was from Herod's district, Pilate sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at the time. Herod was very glad to see Jesus, for he had heard about Jesus and wanted to see him for quite some time. He was hoping to see Jesus perform some sign. Herod questioned Jesus at length, but Jesus didn't respond to him, so he's not cooperating with Herod either. He hasn't answered the chief priests, didn't answer Pilate, now he's not talking to Herod. The chief priests and the legal experts were there fiercely accusing Jesus. Herod and his soldiers treated Jesus with contempt. Herod mocked him by dressing Jesus in elegant clothes and sent him back to Pilate. Pilate and Herod became friends with each other that day. Before this, they had been enemies. They bonded over their mutual not getting answers from Jesus, which, that's something, I guess. So yeah, here in Luke, it's Herod is where he gets the elegant clothes, the purple robe. So how are we doing? Questions, third problems, concerns? As we walk through this passion narrative. Then Pilate called together the chief priests, rulers, and the people. So now we've had a trial with the chief priests. We've had a first trial with Pilate. We've had another questioning with Herod. And now we're back to having another questioning with Pilate again. This is an additional legal proceeding. Luke gives us 4 in this, not just the 3 that the other Gospels do. He said, "You brought me this man before me as one who is misleading the people. I've questioned him in your presence, found nothing in this man's conduct that provides a legal basis for the charges you brought against him. He's innocent of this. Neither did Herod, because Herod returned him to us. Herod thought he was innocent. He's done nothing that deserves death. Therefore, I'll have him whipped and let him go." And actually, the word that is used here is not as severe a whipping as the Matthew word is. So the Matthew word is a very intense beating. The Luke one, he's saying, was just going to be a lighter whipping. I'm not an expert in the types of whipping you can get, but I don't want to go down that road too far. I just have been told that this is not as severe a punishment. With one voice, they shouted, "Away with this man, release Barabbas to us." Barabbas had been thrown into prison because of a riot that had occurred in the city and for murder. So interestingly, the militant upstart is the person they're asking to be released, though that's what they're accusing Jesus to be, someone who's trying to make the people turn against the Roman occupation. It would seem that Barabbas is the one who's inciting these things. Barabbas is Aramaic, by the way, for son of the father, which is kind of an interesting name. Pilate addressed them again because he wanted to release Jesus. They kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." For a third time, Pilate said, "Why? What wrong has he done? I found no legal basis for the death penalty in this case. He's innocent." See, 3 times now Pilate has said he's innocent. "Therefore, I'll have him whipped and let him go." But they were adamant, shouting their demand that Jesus be crucified. Their voices won out. Pilate issued his decision to grant their request. He released the one they asked for, who had been thrown into prison because of a riot and murder, but he handed Jesus over to their will. So the guilty person goes free. The innocent person is going to be crucified. All right, so we're going to walk to the cross now, but before we go, how we doing? Caleb, you look like you had a question.
Was Barabbas a zealot?
I think Barabbas is a zealot, yes. The image we get, a riot and murder is, and if he's being held by Pilate, that's likely a political issue.
Zealots were known to cause uprising.
Yes, exactly. Zealots were known to cause uprisings. Zealots were known to be the ones who wanted to take military action to get the Romans out. So it is very likely, yes, that he is the zealot. I think so. As they led Jesus away, they grabbed Simon, a man from Cyrene who was coming in from the countryside. They put the cross on his back and made him carry it behind Jesus. This is an addition that Luke adds. Not Simon, Simon's elsewhere, but the way this happens. Simon takes up Jesus' cross and follows Jesus. Jesus is actually leading Simon. Simon is carrying Jesus' cross. So that's not subtle, right? I mean, this is not, no subtext here, right? We see him carrying Christ's cross and follow. We've already seen in Luke, right? For those who come after me was take up their cross and follow me. Well, Simon's doing exactly that, taking up Jesus' cross and following. A huge crowd of people followed Jesus, including women who were mourning and wailing for him. Jesus turned to the women and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't cry for me. Rather, cry for yourselves and your children. The time will come when they will say, 'Happy are those who are unable to become pregnant, the wombs that never gave birth, the breasts that never nursed a child.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and the hills, 'Cover us.' If they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it's dry?" If this is happening to me now, you can imagine how bad it's going to be soon when Jerusalem is destroyed, when the temple is destroyed, when lawlessness prevails. The worst is coming. As bad as this is happening now, the worst is coming. So be ready for that. Not an optimistic message. I guess when you're on your way to be crucified, you're not going to have an optimistic message. But they also led 2 other criminals to be executed with Jesus. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing." And they drew lots as a way of dividing up his clothing. Because I find it interesting, this phrase, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing," does not occur in some of the earliest manuscripts of Luke. It is a textual variant. It's in many manuscripts, but it's not in some of the earlier ones. But it also is interesting because even though it is not, it's one of those that nobody doubts is original to Luke. So I have no problem seeing it in there because I think it absolutely is in keeping with Jesus, and it also parallels what's happening to Stephen in Acts. You might recall when Stephen is martyred in Acts, he says, "Don't hold this sin against them," and he's a model of martyrdom at that point. So I think for whatever reason in the craziness of history, that verse fell out of some manuscripts, but thankfully was preserved in others, and that's the reason you'll see this. So some of your Bibles, I mentioned that because some Bibles will have a footnote and will mention that what's in there and what's not in there. So I feel like it's good to just call out and say, yeah, it isn't in the earliest manuscript, but it's probably Luke. It's probably originally Lucan, and there's no problem, I think, finding it in there. So.
I'm so used to like the Christian version of this event, Jesus' crucifixion.
Yeah.
Do they have any other record from Jewish side?
Anna's asking about other depictions or other tellings of the crucifixion of Jesus. Not really. There are stories told, like the historian Flavius Josephus tells the story about a certain Chrestus who his followers say was crucified by the Romans. But you don't get this kind of, you don't get any record keeping anywhere. The Romans wouldn't have had any reason to, and And frankly, I don't know that the Jews would either. They wouldn't want anybody to talk about this guy. They'd rather have him forgotten. And so, yeah, the story's preserved by the people to whom the story was meaningful, the followers of Christ. And they kept the stories alive orally for a generation until you get Mark and then Matthew and then Luke who come along and write them down. Yeah, there's not, it's one of those things where I don't think there's any problem saying that there is plenty of extra biblical evidence that Jesus lived. I think that's true. I think we can agree that Jesus lived. I think there's plenty of evidence of that from what comes later. But we don't have any, primary sources that talk about this event from a perspective that's not invested as a Christian. So that's...
I was just hoping is there like some record of it, like a criminal or something?
Right. If there be some record, no, unfortunately we don't have anything like that. Like I said, the earliest we've got is Flavius Josephus, and he's writing 35 to 40 years after this event, even then. So, yeah, and there are debates about whether what Josephus says is original or if it was inserted by Christian scribes who copied Josephus. So, even there, yeah.
The Jews were heavily incentivized to wipe this out.
Well, yeah, the Jewish leadership was, certainly, yeah.
And they were, they instigated the whole thing.
Well, the Jewish leadership, yeah, because let's not forget the rest of these people are all Jews too, right? All the followers are Jews, right? So it's the political leadership. And I think, and you don't really get that as much, you don't get because Matthew is definitely down on Pharisees. Luke doesn't do that. Luke doesn't name the group that's responsible as much. I honestly believe there's better case to be made that it's the Sadducees that are the big motivators of this, because they are the ones that have the most to lose, and there's a claymation Easter movie. I'll get it. Hold on. The Miracle Maker. And in that claymation movie, it tells the story and it says it's the Sadducees, because they're the ones that were the most invested in everything staying the same. They're the ones who had control of the temple. They're the ones in bed with the Romans. They don't want any zealots. They don't want any uprising. They don't want anything. And so they are likely the ones who are the most motivated for this to go away. Obviously the rest, there's nobody else that really is even going to care about this, that's not invested in it. The Jews the Jewish Christians want to tell the story, and the Sadducees wouldn't have any desire to keep track of it because they want to see it go away.
Who kept all the records? The women.
The scribes would have.
The wailing women following behind.
Yeah. Yeah, they wouldn't have been right. They wouldn't have been writing the story, right? Well, everything would have been kept orally at this point anyway. Yeah, there was no reason to write down anything like this. That I couldn't think of any reason to write down anything like this. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, Luke has 4 trials: the Sanhedrin trial, the Pilate trial, the Herod trial, the Pilate trial. And many people assume this is to parallel what happens to Paul in Acts. Remember I told you there's a lot of parallels between Luke and Acts. And Paul has 4 trials: the Sanhedrin, Felix, Festus, and Agrippa. So Luke is all about the orderly account, right? Things need to rhyme between those stories. And so that's probably why he tells this Pilate story in 2 parts instead of just a single story like the Matthew and Mark do. So, yeah, we don't want to get too wound up about when Luke says he's writing an orderly account, he doesn't necessarily mean what we mean when we say orderly, as in order. He means proper rhetorical storytelling, the way you'd be trained as a Greek rhetorician to tell the story. And that's what he can do. He does it well. The people were standing around watching, but the leaders sneered at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he really is the Christ sent from God, the chosen one." So here at the very end, we get the same temptation that we got from Satan early on, right? Use your power to help yourself. Use your power to benefit yourself, turning stones to bread. Use your power to gain attention, right? Get people's attention this way. Jump off the temple and gain everybody's attention. Here, save yourself if you're really the Christ. So here at the end, we get that revisiting of those temptations. The soldiers also mocked him. They came up to him offering him sour wine, saying, if you're really the king of the Jews, save yourself. Above his head was the notice of the formal charge against him. It read, this is the king of the Jews. One of the criminals hanging next to Jesus insulted him. Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us. So here we get one of the criminals say this. Remember in Mark and in Matthew, both of the criminals were mocking Jesus. But in Luke, the other criminal spoke harshly to him. We get a good criminal here, a smooth criminal, if you will, here in Luke. Don't you fear God, seeing that you've also been sentenced to die? We are rightly condemned. We are receiving the appropriate sentence for what we did. But this man's done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus replied, I assure you that today you'll be with me in paradise. So we get probably the greatest example of grace in the Bible right here. Right? This is better even than the prodigal son, because this guy's got nothing going for him at all, apart from just remember me when you come into your kingdom. That's it. He doesn't even take off for the journey home and practice a speech for his father. This is just welcomed into the kingdom, hanging on the cross. I should talk about paradise, because this is one of those cultural words that I think can help us understand what's going on. Paradise originally was the garden that a king would possess. It's the same word that would be used for the king's garden, so just outside the big palace, right? In the intertestamental period, the word was used as a place for the righteous dead. So when a righteous dead person died, they would go directly to paradise. So the two sources for this, the Apocalypse of Abraham, the righteous dead proceed straight to paradise and enjoy heavenly fruits and blessedness. The unrighteous go immediately to Sheol upon their death. First Enoch says the righteous will dwell in the garden of life, which of course is the image that you get of the word for paradise. So obviously Luke would think this is the bosom of Abraham. He's already talked about that, I think, when he talked about the rich man and Lazarus parable. And Luke is concerned with individual destinations. He talks a little bit about this throughout the gospel. But the word paradise, when you get to Revelation 2, when you get to Revelation 2, I believe it is. And there's another reference, there's a name that I've just forgotten now. 2 Corinthians 10. Paul uses the term. And both in those two contexts, it seems to be the same thing as heaven, like all of the fullness of and completeness of heaven. Is that the way Luke's using it? I don't know. I mean, like I said, the word originally was the receiving area for the king. So I think N.T. Wright likes to see this as I don't say a waiting area, but it is sort of a holding place for those righteous who die before the consummation of the kingdom of God, and we all arm in arm enter in together. This is the lobby of heaven while we're waiting for the show to start. And then once we all get there, we enter into glory together. I mean, I don't know. Who knows what happens when we die? But this is a word that was used originally for the place the righteous dead would immediately go to, right? The garden of God, if you will. In other words, I will not be answering any questions, what happens when you die. That is not going to be my goal. Sorry. Yeah, I know, Anna was waiting to ask that question, but this is what people said happened. I think it's interesting this is the way that word is used, right? This is the context of that word as Luke is telling the story, so I think that's helpful a little bit. So, yeah. Anyway, let's get back to the story. It was now about noon when darkness covered the whole earth until about 3 o'clock when the sun stopped shining. So we have an eclipse. Then the curtain in the sanctuary tore down the middle, crying out in a loud voice. Jesus said, Father, into your hands I entrust my life. Notice you don't get, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? This is the first time we don't get that. Mark said it in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Matthew said it in Hebrew, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. But we don't get it at all in Luke. Jesus is in control in this. Jesus is he's not as No, he's probably about the same. He is. I was thinking about John, right? It is finished. Same kind of idea of Jesus not despairing, but obedient. Whenever Jesus is, we're talking about that vertical relationship in Luke, it's always obedience. He does what God has asked. He's been obedient to this. The horizontal relationship we'll find is loving and welcoming, but it's obedience that we get this way. After he said this, he breathed for the last time. When the centurion saw what happened, he praised God, saying, "It's really true, this man was righteous." Interesting translation here in the Common English Bible, because the word in Greek is innocent. Truly, this was an innocent man, is the way you'll see most translations translate this. He's really an innocent man. We've seen a difference now, because remember, we've had three tellings of this. In Mark, the centurion is the first person in the whole gospel, the first human being in the whole gospel to recognize Jesus as God's son. Truly, this man was the Son of God in Mark. In Matthew, the centurion and his men see that he is truly the Son of God. In Luke, it's the centurion again, and he says he's an innocent man. Remember, this is the point of Luke. Jesus is innocent. He's a martyr. All the crowds who come together to see this event return to their homes beating their chest after seeing what happened. And everyone who knew him, including the women who'd followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance observing these things. Now there was a good man named Joseph who was a member of the council. He was a good and righteous man. He hadn't agreed with the plan of actions of the council. He was from the Jewish city of Arimathea and eagerly anticipated God's kingdom. This man went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Taking it down, he wrapped it in a linen cloth, laid it in a tomb carved out of a rock in which no one had ever been buried. It was the preparation day for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was quickly approaching. The woman who had come with Jesus from the Galilee followed Joseph. They saw the tomb and how Jesus' body was laid in it. Then they went away and prepared fragrant spices and perfumed oils. They rested on the Sabbath in keeping with the commandment. So Joseph of Arimathea, member of the point out, right? A member of the council, didn't agree with it, and saw that, again, Jesus was innocent, right? Disagreed with this punishment. This is an unusual thing. Crucified individuals usually were left on the cross. You died and you rotted off. It was meant to be as gruesome a public spectacle as possible. It was intentionally to be gruesome as possible, because it was truly meant to be a deterrent. It was used as a political tool to say, I don't want to do whatever got this guy on this cross, right? And it's not going to challenge the Roman leadership. I'm not going to do whatever it was. And so usually they would leave the bodies on the cross, so that would, because what happens to your body after you die, that was an important symbol in Jewish custom. There's a reason that it was significant that Jezebel was eaten by dogs. There was a reason it was significant that the blood of Ahab was licked up by dogs. What happens after you die was important. It was an important symbol. And so for Joseph, this is an act of tremendous grace. I mean, this is a man who is touching a dead body during the Passover week, during the Passover, the day of Passover, and now soon to be the feast, the week of Feast of Unleavened Bread. He's giving up, I don't even know how to say this, he's giving up the most important holiday because of his desire to see Jesus given a proper burial. I mean, this is a tremendous act of sacrifice for this religious leader, and I think it's worth acknowledging that. And then to me, the funniest thing in the entire Gospel of Luke, the women see how the men prepared the body and immediately went and bought spices so they could come back later and do it correctly, which is just remarkable to me. That's the funniest thing ever. They saw how Jesus' body was laid and went away and prepared spices and oils. Okay, no, that's not. We'll come back Sunday morning. We'll fix it. It's okay. So amazing. But they see the body laid. This is a genuine death. They understand death. They know death. The Romans know death. There's no question Jesus is dead.
Crucifixion was the moment that our sin was forgiven. Do you think that was some specific meaning, the way Jesus died?
Well, you are asking me a question of soteriology and a question of atonement, and That is going to go far longer than the few minutes we have remaining if I try to answer it here. But it is answered in a number of different ways by a number of different denominations. Okay. Well, the question was a question of salvation. How is this saving, this death saving, right? So this is an atonement question, a soteriological. Soteriology just means the study of salvation, how we're saved. And I'm trying to see how I can answer this briefly. People have disagreed with how this has been interpreted for generations, okay? And for a long time, the church sort of had what was the Christus Victor model, where Jesus, by dying, conquers death. And it really is, what's the big problem here? And in the Eastern church, the big problem is death. And so, in say, the Eastern Orthodox congregations. And so, Easter morning is a big deal. Resurrection, the conquering of death, that is a huge deal. We no longer fear death, right? In the Western tradition, so Roman Catholic and all of the denominations that came off of that, including us, Baptist, the issue was sin, not death, okay? And so for that reason, Good Friday is often a bigger deal than Easter Sunday, because the focus is going to be on the saving death of Christ. John tries to connect this to Passover. John tries to talk about this in terms of, well, I mean, literally the Passover litany says, the blood of the lamb covered the sins of the people. And God passed over that house, you know, when God passed through Egypt. And so John, the Gospel of John, sets up the story of crucifixion as Jesus is the Passover lamb, his sins covering the sins of the people. Right? That's not made explicit in Luke. That's not the way Luke talks about it exactly. In the Middle Ages, there were images of satisfaction that were talked about. It was very much the influence of the royal context they were sitting in. How do you make a king? How do you become acceptable to a king? And so they kind of pushed that vision of how you in this world become acceptable to a king, and they kind of made that theology, right? You get things like substitutionary atonement, where the belief that God, that a debt needed to be paid, and Jesus had to pay the debt for us to be acceptable, which, you know, is problematic if you go too far down that road, because who does God owe the debt to, and why? Justice, right? And again, all these things are interwoven, Anna, right? So how you view God is going to impact how you view salvation. So is the most important characteristic of God holiness, or is the most important characteristic of God love? If it's holiness, then you can get that substitutionary atonement idea, and it can play out and at least make a little bit of sense, because you can compromise God's love a little bit, and the gruesome, brutal death of an innocent man will somehow satisfy God, which I'm not ultimately comfortable with. Love, however, if that's the key of the salvation issue, the key quality of God, then all of a sudden crucifixion is not Jesus saving us from God, but showing us exactly who God is and who we are, the ones who will rebel against God. And God is the one who will love us and forgive us in the midst of that. And the salvation that comes somehow in the understanding of that for us. That's another way of looking at it. Okay. It's a complicated question that you ask. And different people are going to answer it a different way. And you will see different Christian groups answer it different ways as well. And some have only heard it one way. And so other ways seem wrong at that point. And so I have come to be a little more content leaving the issues of atonement and salvation to God. And in other words, I know that God is love. I know that God is just. And I know that what God has done for me will be loving and just. And at the end of the day, the how this works is not one that I necessarily pursue as much. But I am going to know that I am going to say that Jesus is showing us exactly who God is by doing this. Someone who will love us through crucifixion, take the worst we have to offer, and then very shortly we will see, spoiler alert, turn that into life the next day. That is my 7-minute discussion of salvation. And did I do okay there, Meg? It's okay. That's a lot. There's a lot there. There are other options, Anna, but those are the two big ones that I'll go through on that one. I would have rather talked about what happened when we die. Okay. As I said, Jesus' death is martyrdom in Luke. Jesus is innocent. We get this exact word used several times just in this chapter, that Jesus is innocent. Handed over by Jewish leadership and executed by Gentiles. The point is, everybody rejects Jesus. Nobody gets more blame on this one. The Jewish leadership hands him over. The Gentile leadership kills him. There's only two kinds of people in this world. Jews and Gentiles. That's it. This is the whole world that's responsible for the death of Christ. No one's out. No one gets excused. Everybody's guilty. Jesus' silence, the eclipse at his death, the conversion of the thief, all of that mirror stories of prophetic martyrdom in other extra biblical sources. Some intertestamental works, some stories in Maccabees, some stories that in the martyrdom of Polycarp, which is an early church document. A lot of these extra stories all have these elements in them that show an innocent martyr's prophetic death, a death of a prophetic individual, somebody who is truly a martyr on this. So that's the reason you got to tell the story of the eclipse. You got to tell the story. These are all things that these part of the type scene, part of the zeitgeist of the leitmotif. That's what I'm trying to say. The leitmotif of the stories. You have to have these things in there. And his death is a model for all disciples. We see Stephen in Acts follow this pattern almost directly, which isn't surprising since Luke wrote Acts as well. Right? So what happens the next day? Well, very early in the morning on the first day of the week, the women went to the tomb bringing fragrant spices they'd prepared to finally fix the way the men had screwed it up 2 days before. That's my addition. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they didn't find the body of the Lord Jesus. They saw that's where it was. They saw the body of Jesus go in. They said that, right? They don't see him. They didn't know what to make of this. Suddenly, 2 men were standing beside them in gleaming bright clothing. The women were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He isn't here, but has been raised. Remember what he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man, the human one, must be handed over to sinners, be crucified, and the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words. This is an important thing that happens, that the Spirit calls to mind later. What Jesus said, the remembering of his words, being reminded, oh yes, that's what Jesus said. When they returned from the tomb, they reported all these things to the 11 and all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. So a group of women, it would seem. We don't always get the group of women. Sometimes it's just a few, but here it's a group of women. Their words struck the apostles as nonsense, and they didn't believe the women. But Peter ran to the tomb. When he bent over to look inside, he saw only the linen cloth. Then he returned home wondering what had happened. So we're not listening to the women, and we don't believe our own eyes. So a couple of problems here. On the same day, 2 disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened. While they were discussing these things, Jesus himself arrived and joined them on their journey. They were prevented from recognizing him. He said to them, "What are you talking about as you walk along?" They stopped, their faces downcast. The one named Cleopas replied, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who's unaware of all the things that have taken place there over the last few days?" He said to them, "What things?" They said to him, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth. Because of his powerful deeds and words, he was recognized by God and all the people as a prophet. But our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We'd hoped he would be the one who would redeem Israel. All these things happened 3 days ago. But there's more. Some women from our group have left us stunned. They went to the tomb early this morning, didn't find his body. They came to us saying that they even seen vision of angels who told them he is alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women said. They didn't see him. Then Jesus said to them, you foolish people, your dull minds keep you from believing all the prophets talked about. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and then enter his glory? Then he interpreted for them the things written about himself in all the scriptures, starting with Moses and going through all the prophets. When they came to Emmaus, he acted as if he was going on ahead, but they urged him, saying, stay with us, it's nearly evening, the day's almost over. So he went in to stay with them. After he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he disappeared from sight. They said to each other, weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road and when he explained the scriptures for us? Breaking bread is always a euphemism or an idiom for eating. So it's not just that he broke the bread and was seen. It is very likely he ate, and that's when they recognized him, which I think is really funny to me. They didn't know who he was till they saw him eat. And it's like, this is Jesus. You see this, he was always eating like that. So Jesus, but somehow not the same, right? Disappearing, looks different. There's something about the resurrection body that is fully human, but is not quite the same. They got right up, returned to Jerusalem. That's 7 miles back. They just went 7 miles out. They just got 7 miles back. They found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying to each other, the Lord really has risen. He appeared to Simon. Then the 2 disciples described what had happened along the road and how Jesus was made known to them as he broke the bread. So obviously, Jesus had an off-screen appearance to Simon, and then Cleopas and not Cleopas was this is Meg, was it in your Carl? That in her seminary class, Cleopas is named, but the other one is not named. And so you called him Carl. I've heard some that indicate it could be his wife, because we don't get a gender. So it's possible. So Jesus is just showing up to everybody. While they were saying these things, Jesus himself stood among them and said, peace be with you. They were terrified and afraid. They thought they were seeing a ghost. He said, why are you so startled? Probably because you just jumped in this room. That's probably what, no. Why are your doubts arising in your hearts? Look at my hands and feet. It's really me. Touch me and see, for a ghost doesn't have flesh and bones like you see I have. And he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet, because they were wondering and questioning in the midst of their happiness. He said to them, do you have anything to eat? Jesus is always eating, man. They gave him a piece of baked fish. Taking it, he ate it in front of them. Ghosts don't eat. That's why we have to have these stories in here. That's why he's breaking bread with the disciples. That's why he's eating the fish. Ghosts don't eat. This is a physical resurrection. Jesus said to them, these are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law from Moses, the prophets, the Psalms must be fulfilled. So real quick, I like to point out the law from Moses, so Torah, prophets, and the Psalms. We know that by the first century, Torah and prophets were established as canon and scripture by certain Jewish groups like the Pharisees and the Essenes. But we don't know when the writings came together. It seems that at least when Jesus is speaking, if we take Luke's report, and I have no reason not to, that at least by this time the Psalms were recognized as scripture. We don't know about Job and Songs and Esther and some of these others, but at least the Psalms are recognized by this time as scripture. Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. He said to them, this is what is written, the Christ will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day. And a change of heart and life for the forgiveness of sins must be preached in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. Look, I'm sending to you what my Father promised, but you are to stay in the city until you've been furnished with heavenly power. Another difference from Mark and Matthew. In Mark, the disciples are told to go to Galilee. In Matthew, they're in Galilee. But we have no Galilean appearances in Luke. Jesus appears just outside of Jerusalem and in Jerusalem. So we're in this. This is because Luke is setting up what's about to happen in Acts. Right? In Acts, we get, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. Right? So we've got this really cool concentric circle thing that is going to be the picture of our mission work. And if you've got them in the Galilee, it screws up the map. So we're not going to tell the Galilee stories in Luke. If you want to read the Galilee stories, go to John and go to Matthew. But here, it's nice and orderly. Jerusalem, Judea, uttermost parts of the world. That's the way we do this. He led them out as far as Bethany. where he lifted his hands and blessed them. After he blessed them, he left them, was taken up to heaven. They worshiped him, returned to Jerusalem, overwhelmed with joy, and they were continuously in the temple praising God. So the last verse in Luke ends in the temple. The Gospel of Luke begins in the temple, with Zechariah getting the angel's appearance about John the Baptist. So the Gospel starts in the temple and ends in the temple. And we're going to see what in Acts, we could see in Acts, what is happening there is a move away from the temple. So here in Luke, everything's happening in the, framed by the temple, the last temptations in the temple, because he switches those last two temptations in Luke. But in Acts, we're moving away. We're going from Jerusalem, Judea, uttermost parts of the world, to ultimately Paul is arrested in the temple and gets all the way to Rome in that. So, questions, comments, thoughts before we wrap this up? Sure, Hannah. They do. They see him ascend.
The way he exceeded is kind of, make me think temple is somewhere in the sky.
Say this one more. Oh, say it again.
And the way Jesus is like exceeding from the sea.
Oh, yeah?
Make me think the temple is somewhere in the sky.
That the temple, the way he's exiting is making you feel like, well, this is a standard, what's called a standard assumption scene. An assumption is when you are taken up into heaven. And so Elijah, there's the assumption of Elijah. He's taken up into heaven, right? There are traditions about the assumption of Enoch, because in Genesis 6 it says that he walked with God and was no more, right? So the assumption is there. There are traditions, now these are not script, those are scripture, right? Jesus also assumed into heaven. There are traditions that Mary had an assumption, that Moses was assumed into heaven, but those are just stories, and this is a standard way that a holy person would leave the world. So just the way you tell the story. I do have a really funny story that I've shared before, but it's one that you might enjoy. Ben hasn't heard it, so I'll tell it. Years ago, a friend of mine, she was a New Testament professor at Truett. She had a friend and told this story, that her dear friend wanted to go to one of the passion plays that they hold in Texas. I think it was in Granbury, Texas, that they had. And so she went, and it was very moving, that the whole story of Jesus, is the betrayal, the crucifixion. And they crucified Jesus on the cross, and you get, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, and he dies. And the Roman soldier, because we're telling a whole story, right? So from John 2, stabs him to prove that he's dead. Unfortunately, the spear didn't retract. And so the Roman soldier stabbed Jesus on the cross. And at which point Jesus screams because he's just been stabbed. Oh my gosh, he stabbed me! He stabbed me! I'm bleeding! Get me down! Get me down! And so they take Jesus off the cross and they put Jesus' understudy back on the cross. To finish. So we get a nice Gnostic crucifixion. You don't normally get those, but this is pretty cool. So she said, the other Jesus was fine. It was superficial, but still, he got stabbed by a spear, right? Anyway, the other Jesus is in. They go through the rest of the play. Resurrection, teaches the disciples. Everything's great till they get to this part, the Assumption. And they have Jesus wired up. But the weights were set for primary Jesus. Understudy Jesus was 50 pounds lighter than primary Jesus. So he blesses them and leaves them screaming into heaven as the crane shoots Jesus into the air when this happens. To which then the angel had to say, as you have seen him go, you will one day see him return. And you have to see the image of Jesus screaming his way back to earth. On that. I love that story so much. And every now and then I think of that. I was walking across campus one day and thought of Jesus screaming into heaven. And it made me laugh. So anyway, we try so hard sometimes, and sometimes we don't do this. I didn't get to the conclusions. I forgot to get down here to the conclusions. Couple of conclusions here for Luke. Let me get this. As I said before, this is some of the best Greek in the New Testament. Luke and Acts are incredibly complex, vocabulary-wise, structure-wise. It is incredibly difficult to translate. I still have nightmares about Acts chapter 17 on a final exam that I had once. Just really, really tough Greek. Strong attention to historical anchors. We don't get that in the other ones, right? The census of Syria, the Augustus's rule, Quirinius's rule in Syria, those kinds of things. Strong emphasis on the application of ministry to all people. You go first to the Jews, don't go to the Samaritans. You don't get that here. Even the Samaritans that don't welcome Jesus in the next, next chapter, we get the story of the Good Samaritan. So broadly applied. And with this new financial ethic, the kingdom finances is not simply upside down. Matthew and Mark, we do have the rich becoming poor and the poor becoming rich. Luke does that at the beginning, and then all of a sudden we find Zacchaeus come along, and it sort of changes the message. We see this financial ethic unpacked more fully in Acts. The early church in Acts chapter 2 is where Luke is moving with this, but he sets it up here in Luke. And then the final words I have to say on this, some distinctives of Luke. It is a strong emphasis on the poor. It's often called a social gospel. We don't get blessed are the poor in spirit in Luke. We get blessed are the poor, right? It's only Luke who says, I came to seek and save. Jesus as Savior emphasized in Luke more. You don't get that in Matthew and Mark. We get it in John. He builds on this, but Luke is the one who calls him Savior first. I do think it's interesting, aware of earlier accounts and does the research. And I am one of those who has no problems saying that the person who wrote this book is probably named Luke. I know that is just church tradition, but to me, it's one of those times when the church tradition had to be strong because nobody important was named Luke. If you told me this was Peter, if you told me this was somebody, Mary, if you told me this gospel was somebody else, I'm like, okay, sure, right? Tradition, that's what happens. Luke, nobody was named Luke. So the tradition had to have been strong to have someone who is not a major player, not a disciple, you don't get any stories about anybody named Luke, nothing like that, to actually have that tradition. No, that's Luke's gospel. So this is one of those places where it's still anonymous. All the gospel writers were anonymous. Matthew, we call them those names because that's what church tradition has put on them. But I'm willing to go, probably he was named Luke. I think so. Just because it is such an unusual name and such a circumstance, it's probably who it is. Yeah. One of my favorite gospels. I love all the gospels, I do. I really do enjoy Luke. As hard as it was to translate, I just really enjoy Luke. It's a fun book. Yeah. So other thoughts? Assuming the weather cooperates, we'll start John next week, which is probably my favorite gospel. Yeah, I love Mark. I love Luke. Mark and Luke fight for number 2. John is going to be number 1. Augustine said that the Gospel of John was so deep that an elephant could swim, but so accessible a child could wade. And it really is. It's some of the simplest Greek in the entire New Testament. And yet, what he does with that simple vocabulary, right? It's like green eggs and ham, and that's, the story of green eggs and ham was he bet a friend of his told him he couldn't write a book with under 50 words, 50 different words in it. And so Dr. Seuss said, oh yeah? John's kind of like that. Once you learn the word beloved and believe, you're in good shape in John. You can translate the whole thing. So any final thoughts? All right, well, assuming the weather cooperates,